The question is the Government Amendment 8, Lord's Amendment, to be made. Mr. Kevin Brennan.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want to make it clear right at the outset that we remain opposed to this bill. And despite some of the changes that it has undergone in another place, it remains a dreadful, mean-spirited, partisan, petty piece of legislation. Having got that off my chest, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to recognise that members in another place have made a valiant attempt to make a silk purse out of this particular malformed sow's ear, so that after today it may end up being a slightly less ugly sow's ear than it was, but nevertheless will remain a malodorous porcine lug for all their lordships' noble efforts. Now, many of the changes peers made to the bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, are welcome if we consider the crudeness of the bill in its original form. Turning to the first group of Lord's amendments that we are considering in this group and the Government's response to them, Lord's Amendment 2 to Clause 4 of the bill was passed in the other place by 320 votes to 181, requiring the Government to commission a review of electronic voting in industrial action ballots within 6 months of royal assent. And after the review, Amendment 2 would require the Government to publish a strategy for rolling out electronic voting. The Government's Amendment A we're considering would revise the Lord's amendments to state that ministers will only be required to publish a response to the review, but need not take further action to actually introduce e-balloting. Now, the Government, Madam Deputy Speaker, has consistently resisted e-balloting on the grounds that they still had concerns about the safety of electronic balloting. This is despite the fact, as many honourable members have pointed out, that the Conservative Party used electronic ballots for the selection of their London mayoral candidate, although I suppose they may be regretting that, given the poor performance of the candidate that they selected using that particular method, and perhaps that explains the Government's concern. But it's clear that the Government's real objection to e-balloting all along, and indeed to workplace balloting, which we argued for unsuccessfully in this House and in the other place, has been that they don't want high turnouts in these ballots, because that would mean that their new threshold barriers could be more easily reached if more people were more easily able to vote. Not only will all ballots, Madam Deputy Speaker, for industrial action require a minimum 50% turnout under the bill, but those working in the loosely defined important public service group will face an additional hurdle of needing a 40% yes vote from all those eligible to vote. And that means that these thresholds place higher requirements on industrial action ballots of this kind than on any other democratic process within the United Kingdom. For example, the 50% turnout threshold was not reached for the last London mayoral election or most local government and devolved elections. Now, the Government's tabled Amendment A, revising that Lord's Amendment, which we're considering today. It's agreed that ministers should be required to commission an independent review on the use of e-ballots, as suggested, for industrial action ballots within 6 months of royal assent. It's agreed that it will be possible to run pilots as part of that review, as the Minister said, but it is proposing that after the review, ministers would need to publish a response, but not necessarily to take any further action, and there'd be no requirement to publish a strategy for rolling out electronic voting. I will give way briefly.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and isn't there a slight concern here that this is just a delaying tactic by the Government, who does not intend to introduce these measures? And given that in the year 2016 many people are quite used to banking online, they're quite used to registering to vote online, submitting their tax returns online, don't these questions about security and anonymity really fall by the wayside?
Absolutely.
Well, I know the Minister, and I take him at his word when he says that isn't his intention, that this isn't a delaying tactic. But to coin a phrase, he is a here today, gone today Minister, and I say that from experience, as a former Minister myself, and somebody else eventually may well in the future occupy his place and may well not have the good intentions that he's outlined to the House today on the record. And we, of course, have to legislate for that possibility, Madam Deputy Speaker, rather than assume that somebody with goodwill will occupy that seat into the future in perpetuity. But I will in a moment, yes. But it's proposing after the review it wouldn't have to publish a strategy. Now, let me be clear about this. We don't think the government's amendment is necessary. And we accept, and I do accept, it's moved a long way in accepting the review, the pilots and the requirement to lay the report before Parliament, and accepting the need to consult experts and get advice and recommendations, and the need to commission the report within 6 months of the passing of the Act. These are significant changes and go part of the way to achieving what we've argued for right from the start of this bill in the Commons. And indeed, they achieve most of what was agreed by peers in the other place on a cross-party basis with cross-bench support down in the Lords. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm most grateful to him. As someone who, along with other colleagues, including my right honourable friend for Halton, Price and Howden, considered that electronic balloting is probably the right way to go, would he not recognise the Minister's and the Government's progress in this direction and welcome that? And I believe the Minister, and indeed any future Minister, but I hope he remains in this place for a long time, will ensure that the evidence is looked at, and provided the evidence shows electronic balloting is the right way to go, which I very much hope it is, we will go forward with that.
Well, obviously I can't comment on how long the Minister will remain in this particular post. In the forthcoming reshuffle, we'll see. But I did, I think, recognise the movement that the government has made, and I want to make it clear that I do recognise that, although I've made it clear that we think that this is an unnecessary amendment that the government's making to their Lordship's amendment, and indeed that the whole matter could have been dealt with in a much more straightforward manner. But we are where we are, having received amendments from the Lords, and that's all we can discuss today in a moment. Ultimately, it seems to me inconceivable, Madam Deputy Speaker, that any minister, having received a report on how e-balloting could be introduced safely, would then deny trade union members the opportunity to participate in a ballot using modern electronic communications. The only possible reason for ministers at that future point to reject an expert report outlining the appropriate way to introduce modern technology into ballots and to offer the opportunity for easier participation in a democratic vote would be a desire to suppress turnout. That would be the only possible explanation. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way, and he comes right to the point, because he does not have to rely on the goodwill of this Minister, who I'm sure will be in Cabinet in 6 months. The reason I asked him to say at dispatch box the intent of the government on receipt of the report was so that if another Minister were ever tempted not to follow the explicit policy line now, he and I could hold him to account in this chamber.
Indeed, I don't know whether future Prime Minister Gove will appoint him to the Cabinet or not. We shall have to wait and see. But the point he makes is exactly right, that's why I think the government's amendment is unnecessary and does dilute the effect of the acceptance of the rest of the Lord's amendment. However, I'm seeking to put on record the fact that should any future minister take another path, having had a clear recommendation on this report, then one could only interpret their intentions as being less than honourable if that were the course of action that a future minister were to take. I'll give way.
Mr Deputy Speaker, could you advise me whether it's in order for the House to spend quite so much time talking about my career prospects? Because I do not feel they're really helping.
Is that good or bad for the House?
I'm happy to leave him alone then for the rest of the debate, apart from the issues that we're discussing here today. Now, if any minister did take that path, obviously there would be considerable anger and opposition, not just from us, but from other parties and also in the other place, who worked so hard to craft this amendment on electronic balloting. In practice, the momentum for e-balloting, I think, will be unstoppable if that report is published and comes to those conclusions that we think it probably will. But we prefer the Lord's amendment, and we would seek this afternoon to keep it in the bill. Now, moving to Lord's Amendment 17 on facility time, the other part of this group, and the government's motion to disagree with the Lord's amendment, and indeed the government's proposed additions to the reinstated clause 13 if in fact the House decides to reinstate that clause by voting to disagree with the Lords. The Lords passed Amendment 17, again by 248 votes to 160, which removed the power for ministers to impose a cap on union facilities by deleting clause 13 from the bill. The government has tabled a motion this afternoon, Mr Deputy Speaker, to disagree with Lord's Amendment 17 so that they can restore their ability to impose a cap on facilities. They've proposed a further amendment to amend the reinstated clause in line with assurances that they gave in the Lords, and to provide that no cap could be imposed for the first 3 years after the new reporting requirements on facilities come into force. Before ministers could impose a cap, they'd need to review the published data on facilities, the cost of facilities for the relevant employer, the nature of the services run by the public authority, and any particular factors relevant to the employer and other related matters. They'd also need to consider the type of organisation and any relevant factors, for example, if the organisation was facing a major restructure. And now, if the Minister has concerns about the level of facilities in a particular public authority, under the provisions that they're proposing, they would need to write to the employer expressing their concerns. I will give way.
Friend also agreed that the Minister seemed to skate over this, is that what this is going to cost the taxpayer in terms of having to review all this information. Surely, if it's going to be done thoroughly and effectively, it will have come at great cost to the taxpayer.
Well, indeed, and given that the stated purpose of what the government's doing is to look after the interests of the taxpayer, it is ironic that what my honourable friend has said is exactly the case. But as I said earlier, we're dealing with what we've got back from the Lords. We would not have wished this to remain in the bill at all, and indeed we'd support the Lords' amendment to remove this from the bill completely, but I'm simply setting out to the House the consequences of not doing so. Now, the original Clause 13 included a reserved power for government ministers to introduce regulations imposing an arbitrary cap on the amount of time which union reps in the public sector can spend in the workplace, improving health and safety standards, promoting learning and training opportunities, consulting on redundancies or on 2P transfers, negotiating better pay and conditions, and even representing members in grievances and disciplinary hearings. I want to make it clear, we agree with the Lords that the clause should have been removed altogether from the bill on facility time. It's an unnecessary interference in the conduct of good industrial relations, and the government's professed desire, in fact, to support devolution, as honourable members have pointed out, including the honourable gentleman and my honourable friend and neighbour from Cardiff Central. So it goes against what the government has said is its professed desire to do on devolution, and it is being resisted, as he will know, by the devolved administrations. We acknowledge, however, that significant advances have been made in the Government Amendment A, so it's our position that we support the Lords and we want this clause removed from the bill. However, if the House decides not to do so, Government Amendment A will at least make some improvement to a proposal which should never have appeared in the first place. Can I first of all say that I didn't in the previous section declare my membership of Unite the Union and also my very proud membership of the Musicians' Union before saying what I have to say on this group of amendments from the Lords, most of which, as the Minister said, the government is accepting. I won't repeat, because we are under a limited time constraint, all of the amendments. The Minister himself, I think, highlighted the significant changes, including check-off, which we very much welcome. And he will recall when we had the debate here in this House on report, that his honourable friend, the member for Stafford, I should tell him, is his honourable friend, that's his honourable friend's constituency, did put down an amendment, and I pointed out it was an extraordinary provision that a Conservative government was seeking to make illegal, a voluntary arrangement between parties on even where one party is paying for that service, when that arrangement is neither immoral or illegal. And that would have been an extraordinary illiberal measure, and I'm glad that in their Lordship's House the government gave way on that matter, and it's no longer in the bill, and that is very welcome. And I also welcome what he said on the record in relation to the certification officer in his remarks. I think it's extremely important that the government does recognise the concerns that have been expressed about the potential for vexatious complaints by third parties and the tremendous waste of time that could be for all concerned. So I welcome what he said on the record about that, and also welcome the promise of a review of how that is working out in practice. Although we don't agree, and I made that clear with what the government's doing in relation to the certification officer, that is a welcome assurance, and I'm glad that he's put that on the record here at this stage before the bill goes back to the Lords. Now, the other part of this group of amendments, perhaps the most controversial part and one of the most contentious parts of the bill, has been the government's desire to create an opt-in process for trade union political funds, and that's relating to Lords Amendments 7 and 8. The original government proposal would have meant that existing trade union members who pay into their union's political fund would have had to opt back into that fund in writing within 3 months of the passage of the bill, and to do so again after 5 years. Now, imagine, Madam Deputy Speaker, if every organisation in the country was required to get a recommitment to every standing order payable for it, for example, within 3 months in writing by post. It would obviously only result in one thing: massive problems for that organisation, whether it was a bank or a voluntary organisation or any other membership organisation or any kind of subscription to a magazine or whatever it was. It always seemed clear to us that this was an utterly unworkable proposal, mainly designed, it seemed to us, to unilaterally deprive the governing party's main political opponent, i.e. the Labour Party, of an important source of its funding, i.e. it seemed a pretty naked attempt to undermine effective opposition in this place and beyond from the Labour Party. That's why, when the bill reached the House of Lords, they set up a special select committee to look at this, as the Minister said, under the able chairmanship of Lord Burns, and we too are grateful for his efforts, and obviously the efforts of his colleagues, both on the committee and in the House of Lords. And we really should thank them, and not just Labour peers, but peers from other political parties and crossbenchers, for approaching this issue in such an imaginative and collaborative way. And I recognise, I suppose, as the House of Lords did in what they produced in that report, that the government did make a manifesto commitment in relation to the introduction of opt-in. I should say, by the way, it made other manifesto commitments about big business, and we haven't yet seen much action in relation to those, but we'll leave that for the moment. Nevertheless, it said it was going to introduce opt-in in its manifesto, and it was elected with an overall majority in the House of Commons, albeit on less than 40% of the vote, and so it has been able to argue that the Lords shouldn't remove opt-in from the bill, under the normal conventions that are followed in the other place. But I think what the Lords have achieved, Madam Deputy Speaker, in their amendment is therefore extremely skillfully done. They've taken the view that opt-in should only apply to new members of a trade union, that there should be a longer period of time, at least 12 months, for trade unions to adjust their rules and procedures, and that there should be no automatic requirement to opt in again after 5 years. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Would my honourable friend also agree that this will not be very difficult for many trade unions, because on many trade unions' application forms to join, there is a box to tick to contribute to the political... As someone who actually ran a political fund, certainly in the GMB union that was the case. So isn't it another example of legislation which is not really needed?
Well, I'm not surprised that, as he's physically mistaken for me, that our opinions should be identical in relation to this matter, and I completely agree with the point he made in his intervention. I will give way.
Thank my friend for giving me. Can I just take him back to when he said about the work of the House of Lords? Can I echo the words of Lord Patrick Cormack, who was a member of this House for 40 years, who said, we don't have advance on that, i.e. The opt-out going quicker, at such a pace that we see a disadvantage one of the great parties of the realm and unbalance our democracy in the process. Isn't he getting the nub of what this was all about? It was about unbalancing democracy in this House and disadvantaging this party. Sir Patrick Cormack was absolutely right. It's a shame there's not more like Ian sitting over there now today.
Pay tribute to Lord Cormack for his work on this and what he said in the House of Lords. He might seem to some an unlikely hero of the working class, but actually I think in this instance, I think what he's done has reflected what really one nation conservatism should mean. That is bandied about as a phrase from time to time, but I think his interventions in the House of Lords, along with other colleagues in the House of Lords, has reminded us that we legislate for not just for one Parliament, but into the future. And I'll go on to describe, I think, why it would have been very dangerous had the government stuck to the plans that they originally outlined in this area. And as I said, they've looked at a workable way in the Lords, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the government to introduce its stated manifesto commitment without it becoming a crude and clumsy device to starve the second largest party in Parliament of a long-standing source of finance from the very institutions, incidentally, that founded the party concerned, that in other words, the Labour Party. And I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I think my honourable friend really was just saying this in another way, that they've done the government a big favour by doing this. Had these proposals been proceeded with on the original basis, it would have created, have no mistake about it, a lasting bitterness and resentment in the trade union and labour movement, and beyond indeed, because we are grateful for the support there's been from other political parties in relation to this. And I have no doubt, as many of their lordships pointed out, and indeed as the Select Committee report noted in paragraph 130, I have a copy of it here, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I quote, that it would make the Labour Party more inclined to take unilateral action against the Conservative Party and its funding when next in government. And that was paragraph 130 of that cross-party report in the House of Lords. So it would appear, Madam Deputy Speaker, at this very late hour that this point has hit home to ministers, and I very much welcome that. The government's decided to think again on the proposals on political fund opt-ins. It's tabled the replacement amendments K to N to Lords Amendments 7 and 8. They mean that the requirement to opt into political funds will only apply to new union members. As a result, union members who've already voluntarily agreed to make contributions won't be required to opt in again to support ongoing trade union campaigns. Existing members will only be required to opt in if their union votes to establish a political fund for the first time. It's also conceded on the 5 years. It allows for a minimum 12-month transition period for unions. Union members will be able to opt in or opt out on paper, but also using electronic means. We're back to that. So it's okay to use electronic means now to opt in. We will eventually get to ballots, I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, including online forms, emails and potentially texts. Unions will still be required to remind members annually of their right to opt out. They can do so using individual communications or through their usual systems for informing members, including union newsletters or notice boards. The new government amendment takes on board, I think, all of the core element of Lord Burns's proposals in the report, and I remind the House that that passed the Lords by 320 votes to 172. So it actually passed by an even greater majority than the majority that set up the Select Committee in the first place, showing a growing support for that approach. And I still believe these proposals for an opt-in system political funds are totally unnecessary. I think we should put that on the record, but we do recognise that what the government's now proposing is a substantial improvement on the original bill, which would have required all members to opt in within 3 months and to renew that opt-in within 5 years. And on that basis, whilst retaining our opposition to the bill in general and to opt-in in particular, we won't seek to divide the House on the government amendments, given the substantial nature of the concessions that they brought forward. I'd just like to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will give way.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way, and I agree with him that what is behind this intention to move from opt-out to opt-in is quite clearly an attempt by some members of the Conservative Party to attack the funding of the Labour Party. But I wonder if he would agree with me that our defence of the right of trade unions to engage in political activity will be more effective if we make sure that that is them engaging in activity not just necessarily to support the Labour Party, but to engage in other political action and to achieve the change and support whichever parties they feel is in their members' best interests.
I mean, I think it's accepted there's a special relationship between the Labour Party and the trade union movement. They founded the Labour Party, and of course, political funds, they do campaign in all sorts of ways and for all sorts of campaigns. All I would say is I am grateful to all parties who have recognised the importance within our constitution of the political funds of trade unions and the vital role that they play in our democracy. Trade union money is the cleanest money in politics compared with some of the sources of money and donations to political parties, and long may that continue. I don't want to detain the House much longer, Madam Deputy Speaker, but it would be remiss of me not to conclude my remarks on this section without paying tribute to all those who have made this change possible and indeed worked so hard to improve this dreadful bill. I include in that all my honourable friends in our BIS frontbench team, including my honourable friend, the Shadow Secretary of State, and former members of that frontbench team who helped at earlier stages of this bill, and members from other parties in this House who've helped to fight the good fight, as well as members of my honourable friends on this side of the House. I want to pay a special tribute, Madam Deputy Speaker, to my very good friend, Baroness Smith of Basildon, and her team in the Lords, Lord Hayter, Stevenson and Mendelssohn, as well as all the other peers from other parties and from no party at all who voted to create the Select Committee and worked so diligently and expertly to get us to where we are today. It's said, Madam Deputy Speaker, that our constitution means that the opposition has its say, but the government gets its way. In this instance, the opposition has had its say and, at least in part, also got its way. And as a result, this is a piece of legislation which has had some of the most pernicious edges knocked off, even if it remains a pig's ear.